Welcome back to the Haunted Lore, where we uncover the dark stories that lurk beneath the surface of America's most haunted places. We're traveling to Charlotte, North Carolina, where among the weathered headstones of the city's oldest cemetery, a restless spirit continues to terrorize visitors more than a century after his violent crime shocked the community. This is the story of Devil Charlie, a man whose heinous act of murder would forever bind his soul to the very ground where Charlotte's founders now rest. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a tale that will make you question whether some sins are too dark to ever find peace. But first, if you're new to the Haunted Lore, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. We explore the most chilling ghost stories and urban legends every week. You won't want to miss what we have coming up. What makes Old Settlers Cemetery a magnet for the supernatural? To understand why Devil Charlie's spirit finds such fertile ground for manifestation, we must first examine the cursed foundation upon which his legend was built. Old Settlers Cemetery predates Charlotte as a city, making it not just the oldest burial ground in the area, but a witness to every tragedy, every secret, and every violent death that has shaped this southern city. The cemetery's troubles began decades before Devil Charlie's arrival. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, grave robbing plagued this sacred ground. Body snatchers would descend under cover of darkness, desecrating graves to steal corpses for medical schools and anatomy classes. These weren't merely criminal acts, they were spiritual violations that many believe opened doorways between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The constant disturbance of the dead created an atmosphere of supernatural unrest that permeated the very soil. When you consider that Charlotte's founders and earliest residents were already buried here, their spirits potentially agitated by decades of grave robbing, you begin to understand why this cemetery became a beacon for paranormal activity. The location itself holds significance beyond its age. Old Settlers Cemetery occupies ground that has witnessed the full spectrum of human emotion across generations. Joy and sorrow, love and loss, hope and despair have all been played out within its boundaries. This emotional residue, combined with the spiritual disturbances from grave robbing, created the perfect conditions for supernatural manifestations. Who was Charles Polk before he became Devil Charlie? Understanding the transformation from man to monster requires examining the ordinary life that Charles Polk led before his descent into infamy. He arrived in Charlotte as an unremarkable figure, a working man with a wife named Polly and an infant son. To his neighbors, he appeared to be just another resident trying to make his way in the growing city. Polk worked to support his family during an era when economic hardship was common and domestic problems were handled privately. The pressures of providing for a wife and baby in uncertain times weighed heavily on many men of his generation. Yet, thousands of men faced similar struggles without resorting to violence, which makes his transformation all the more chilling. The exact timeline of his psychological deterioration remains lost to history, but what we do know is that beneath the surface of this seemingly normal family life, dark tensions were building. Perhaps it was financial stress, perhaps alcoholism, or perhaps something more sinister was taking root in his mind. What transforms an ordinary man into a killer? This question haunted the Charlotte community then, and it continues to haunt us today. The answer may lie in understanding that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it grows quietly in the shadows of everyday life, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. What happened on that fatal day in Charlotte? The incident that would forever brand Charles Polk as Devil. Charlie occurred in his own home, transforming a domestic space into a crime scene that would shock the entire community. On that fateful day, Whatever tensions had been building in the Polk household reached a violent crescendo. Polly Polk was in her home, caring for their infant son, when her husband's simmering rage finally erupted. The details that have survived tell us that she was holding their baby when Charles raised his firearm. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion. It was a calculated act of violence that showed complete disregard for innocent life. The murder weapon itself was significant in an era when firearms were tools of survival and protection. By turning his gun on his family, Charles perverted the very purpose of the weapon, transforming it from a protector into a destroyer. The sound of that fatal gunshot would echo through Charlotte's collective memory for generations. What makes this crime particularly heinous is the callousness it required. A normal person, even in the grip of rage, would hesitate to fire a weapon while their infant was in harm's way. But Charles Polk showed no such restraint, no such humanity. In that moment, he crossed a line that separated him from civilized society and earned him a nickname that would outlive his mortal body. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Polly Polk lay dead, her infant son left traumatized and motherless, and Charles Polk had transformed himself from a husband and father into something the community could only describe as diabolic. How did Charlotte react to this unthinkable crime? The news of Polly Polk's murder spread through Charlotte like wildfire, creating a wave of horror that rippled through every level of society. In an era when domestic violence was often handled quietly within families, the brutality and circumstances of this crime made it impossible to ignore or explain away. Local newspapers provided extensive coverage with detailed accounts that shocked readers throughout the region. The fact that an infant had been present during the murder was emphasized repeatedly, as this detail crystallized the community's horror at the crime's callousness. Editorial writers struggled to find words adequate to describe the evil that had been revealed in their midst. Churches throughout Charlotte held special prayer services, with ministers grappling with the theological implications of such seemingly motiveless violence. Congregations gathered not just to pray for the soul of Polly Polk, but to seek comfort in the face of an act that challenged their understanding of human nature itself. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the community's conflicting desires for justice and their fear of the accused. Court records reveal that witnesses were reluctant to testify, not out of sympathy for Charles Polk, but out of genuine fear of what he might be capable of if given the opportunity for revenge. Local residents began avoiding areas where the Polk family had lived, and some reported feeling an oppressive presence in places where Charles had been seen. This reaction suggests that the community's fear went beyond his capacity for physical violence to encompass a deeper terror of the evil he represented. Where did the community choose to bury this evil? One of the most intriguing aspects of Devil Charlie's story is how the details of his actual death have been lost to time, while the location of his burial and the supernatural events surrounding it have been preserved in vivid detail. Historical records that document his heinous crime with such clarity fall silent when it comes to explaining how or when Charles Polk met his own end. This absence of information tells us something profound about how communities choose to remember and forget. Perhaps his death was too mundane to warrant the same attention his crime received. Maybe he died of illness, old age, or some other unremarkable cause that the community felt didn't deserve documentation. Or perhaps the residents of Charlotte deliberately chose not to record the details of his passing, hoping that by ignoring his death, they could somehow diminish his legacy. Whatever the reason, this gap in the historical record only adds to the mystery surrounding the man who became Devil Charlie. The decision of where to inter Charles Polk after his death created a controversy that revealed the community's struggle with how to handle the remains of someone they considered irredeemably evil. Old Settlers Cemetery, as Charlotte's oldest and most significant burial ground, was the logical choice for practical reasons. but many residents felt his presence would contaminate the sacred ground where their city's founders rested. The burial took place with minimal ceremony, a stark contrast to the elaborate Victorian funerals typically held for Charlotte's residents. His grave was marked with a simple headstone bearing only his real name, as if the community couldn't bring itself to acknowledge his infamous nickname even in death. The location chosen for his grave within the cemetery speaks volumes about the community's feelings. While Charlotte's founders and prominent citizens were buried in the cemetery's most prestigious sections, Charles Polk's final resting place was deliberately positioned in a less prominent area, as if even in death, the community sought to maintain distance from his malevolent presence. Groundskeepers noticed unusual difficulties maintaining the area around his grave almost immediately. Flowers planted nearby would wither quickly, grass grew poorly, and even hardy weeds seemed to struggle in the soil surrounding his headstone. These early signs suggested that the earth itself was rejecting the presence of the man buried beneath it. The contrast between the elaborate Victorian memorials surrounding his burial site and the modest marker over his grave seemed to reflect the community's desire to minimize his presence, even as they were forced to acknowledge his existence in their city's history. What supernatural phenomena have visitors encountered? The paranormal activity surrounding Devil Charlie's grave has been documented by countless visitors over the decades, with reports that remain remarkably consistent despite coming from witnesses who had no knowledge of previous encounters. These experiences suggest that his spirit is not merely present in the cemetery, but actively engaged with the living world. The most frequently reported phenomenon is the sound of laughter, not warm or joyful, but cold and mocking. This laughter seems to emanate from the area around his grave, often occurring when visitors discuss his crimes or express sympathy for his victims. Witnesses describe the sound as so chilling that it compels them to flee the cemetery immediately. Shadow figures have been observed near his gravesite, particularly during twilight hours, when the boundary between day and night creates optimal conditions for spiritual manifestations. These shadows don't behave like normal shadows cast by trees or monuments. Instead, they move independently, sometimes appearing to watch visitors or follow them as they walk through the cemetery. Electronic devices frequently malfunction in the vicinity of his grave, with cameras producing unexplained images, voice recorders capturing sounds inaudible to human ears, and cell phones draining their batteries at accelerated rates. This electromagnetic interference suggests a powerful spiritual presence that affects the very fabric of reality around his burial site. Physical sensations reported by visitors include sudden temperature drops, difficulty breathing, and the feeling of invisible hands touching them. These manifestations indicate that his spirit possesses the ability to affect the material world, making encounters with him potentially dangerous rather than merely unsettling. Why do some spirits remain earthbound while others find peace? The question of why Devil Charlie's spirit remains trapped at Old Settlers Cemetery while other deceased individuals find peace touches on fundamental beliefs about death, justice, and the nature of the soul itself. Understanding this supernatural imprisonment requires examining both psychological and spiritual factors that might prevent a spirit from moving on. Unlike typical ghost stories where the deceased is a victim of violence, Devil Charlie was the perpetrator. This suggests that his spiritual imprisonment stems not from trauma, but from guilt, remorse, or perhaps even punishment imposed by forces beyond our understanding. In many spiritual traditions, those who commit grave sins during their lifetime may be refused entry to the afterlife until they have somehow atoned for their actions. The concept of unfinished business takes on a different meaning in Devil Charlie's case. Rather than seeking to complete a task or deliver a message, his spirit may be trapped by the weight of his crime, unable to move forward because he has never faced true justice or redemption. His haunting might represent attempts to interact with the living world in ways that could lead to his eventual release. The emotional energy generated by the living also plays a crucial role in spiritual manifestations. The fear, anger, and horror that Devil Charlie's story continues to generate may actually be feeding his spirit, providing the energy needed to manifest in our physical world. This creates a tragic cycle where his continued presence generates more fear, which in turn strengthens his ability to remain earthbound. Some paranormal researchers theorize that certain locations can trap spirits, particularly those with histories of violence or emotional trauma. Old Settlers Cemetery, with its background of grave robbing and spiritual disturbance, may have created the perfect conditions for holding on to a spirit that would otherwise have been forced to face whatever judgment awaits in the afterlife. How has this dark legend evolved through time? The transformation of Charles Polk from historical figure into the legendary Devil Charlie represents a fascinating evolution of folklore that demonstrates how communities process and preserve their darkest memories. This metamorphosis reveals as much about the people telling the story as it does about the man at its center. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, the focus was on warning the community about the dangers of domestic violence and the importance of vigilance. Early retellings emphasized the facts of the crime and its impact on the surviving family members, serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked rage. As decades passed and direct witnesses died, supernatural elements began to attach themselves to the story. The community's need to make sense of seemingly senseless violence led to the addition of ghostly encounters and paranormal phenomena. This transformation elevated Devil Charlie from a simple criminal into something more archetypal, a representation of evil that transcended the specifics of his historical crimes. The rise of ghost tourism in Charlotte brought his legend to new audiences more interested in thrills than historical accuracy. This shift led to embellishments and dramatizations that, while entertaining, sometimes obscured the real tragedy at the story's heart. The focus gradually shifted from honoring the victim to sensationalizing the perpetrator. Modern retellings often emphasize paranormal aspects while glossing over the brutal realities of domestic violence that the original crime represented. This evolution reflects society's complicated relationship with true crime narratives and our tendency to transform real tragedies into entertainment, sometimes at the cost of remembering the human lives that were lost. What role does this cemetery play in Charlotte's dark tourism? Old Settlers Cemetery has become a cornerstone of Charlotte's supernatural tourism industry, with Devil Charlie's story serving as one of the most popular attractions for visitors seeking paranormal experiences. This transformation raises important questions about the commercialization of tragedy and the ethics of ghost tourism. Professional ghost tour operators have developed elaborate narratives around his haunting, incorporating theatrical elements and dramatic storytelling techniques designed to maximize emotional impact. These tours typically visit his grave during evening hours when supernatural activity is believed most likely, creating an atmosphere of suspense and anticipation that draws visitors from across the region. The constant stream of tourists seeking supernatural encounters has fundamentally changed the character of the cemetery, transforming it from a place of quiet reflection into a stage for ghost stories. This shift has brought economic benefits to the city, but has also created tension between commercial interests and the need to maintain dignity and respect for all those buried there. Local historians and preservationists have expressed concerns about the impact on the cemetery's historical integrity. The focus on Devil Charlie's story sometimes overshadows the legitimate historical significance of other individuals interred at Old Settlers Cemetery, reducing Charlotte's founders and early residents to background characters in a ghost story. The success of ghost tourism has created a complex relationship between the city and Devil Charlie's legend. While the revenue is welcomed, officials must balance commercial interests with the responsibility to preserve the cemetery's historical importance and maintain appropriate respect for the dead. As we reach the end of our journey into the dark history of Devil Charlie and Old Settlers Cemetery, we're left with more questions than answers. Was Charles Polk simply a man who committed a terrible crime, or was there something genuinely evil about him that continues to manifest in the supernatural encounters reported by visitors to his grave? The tragedy of Polly Polk and her infant son should never be forgotten in our fascination with the paranormal aspects of this story. Behind every ghost story lies a human tragedy, and Devil Charlie's legend was built on the foundation of a woman's murder and a child's trauma. As we explore these dark tales, we must remember to honor the victims as well as acknowledge the perpetrators. If you found today's episode compelling, make sure to subscribe to The Haunted Lore and share it with fellow lovers of the supernatural. Next week, we'll be exploring another dark corner of American folklore with the story of the Crying Woman of Magnolia Cemetery in Mobile, Alabama. You won't want to miss it. Don't forget to follow us on social media for behind-the-scenes content, bonus stories, and updates on upcoming episodes. And if you have a haunted location or ghostly encounter you'd like us to investigate, send us a message. We love hearing from our listeners, and your story might just become our next episode.